discomfort. Yeah, so as we can see, there are a lot of intense emotions, and confrontation generally leads to discomfort, and it's something that we do not enjoy. It brings up a lot of fear and anxiety, and it's not something that we're naturally drawn to. So I'm going to take us to the next slide, and I would love for you to take a guess. What percentage of people handle conflict situations at work by just ignoring them? What would you guess are the general percentage? Okay, we've got a ambitious 62% there. 53. Right, so I'm going to show you the answer. So research actually shows that 53% of individuals decide to rather ignore conflict as opposed to handling them. And I think what this shows us is, firstly, that we're not alone and it's normal to feel uncomfortable. But I would say, secondly, and perhaps more importantly, that half of the time we miss out on an opportunity to grow and to strengthen the relationships in our team and to increase the level of trust in our team. And what is sad is this also impacts the way that we operate as a team, and in the end, the way that we serve our mission and how well we're able to increase our impact. So it's so wonderful that you're here, because you're taking the first step to just become a bit more comfortable with conflict and not miss out on these great opportunities to handle them and to make the most of them. So I'm very excited, and yeah, so honored to introduce John to you. He's our topic specialist, and he will guide us through the rest of the session. So John, why don't you take us away and show us the beauty that could be found in conflict situations.
Great to be here with you. It's really unusual, I guess, for an Asian to be able to take you through this session, because Asians are probably known as people who like to avoid conflict, and so I don't lead this session as an expert, but as a fellow learner, fellow sojourner with you. And when I think about this whole subject, of course, the question is, where does one learn how to deal with conflict? I think for me, it was watching my parents, and I'm a huge fan of free play on the playground. I think children that play together on the playground learn how to deal with conflict, and it's great. We must avail unsupervised play for children. I think getting married and being a parent has also been a great training ground. And obviously for most of us on this call, being a ministry leader or an organizational leader throws us into the deep end of learning how to navigate this. On the screen, you will see a definition. Let me read it out to you. A conflict exists when two parties perceive that their positions are incompatible, that there are scarce resources, and or the actions of one person block, interfere with, or in some way make the achievement of the other's goal less likely. This definition is interesting because it actually comes from a certain vantage point, and I'll present you two. The first vantage point, the first viewpoint, is where conflict is traditionally viewed as bad and avoidable. And fear or shame or guilt helps to generate this kind of conflict. People who are in conflict with you and I are probably viewed as troublemakers or even problematic, especially if you're the leader. Conflict can be demotivating, it can increase cynicism, it can damage interpersonal relationships, it can really hinder risk-taking and proactive or taking initiative. So that's the first viewpoint. Conflict is bad. Stay away. Try to eliminate, minimize, mitigate, and that's I think a default position for lots of people. There is a second viewpoint, and that is where conflict is inevitable, it's inescapable, and so you have to live with it, you have to leverage it, and actually it can be potentially good. So conflict could be functional and helpful to help your organization, your team to grow and to seek out positive change. Conflict can help to challenge existing beliefs, existing paradigms, Lencioni would say, if your meeting doesn't have conflict, then it's probably a very boring one, because conflict helps to energize meetings, helps to revitalize, flagging emotions. So it's potentially good. And that's the viewpoint that we want to introduce to you this afternoon here in South Africa. So what is important is not so much that conflict is inevitable in our interpersonal relationships, but really how we respond to it and how we manage it. So there are different kinds of conflict. The first kind would be intrapersonal. So you wrestle with yourself. For example, you know what God is calling you to do. You have a purpose, or there's something prophetic over your life, and you wrestle with obeying that. So that's intrapersonal. Interpersonal, between two people. There are conflicts between or within small groups, and then within large groups, and then finally between groups. So you see these 5 types of conflict. And I think all of us are familiar with conflict. I mean, it's really impossible to avoid this in life, isn't it? Especially if you're an organizational leader. What I'd like to take us to now is to probe a little deeper into what are the roots of conflict. So let me invite you to respond in the chat box. How would you answer this question? What are the roots of conflict? Put in as many responses as you would like. Perhaps it has to do with, culture or cultural differences. So you type that down and let's populate the chat box. I'll stay silent for about 30 seconds. Let me read a few of the responses. Selfishness, selfish ambition, pride, holding on to our own perspectives too strongly. Root could be rejection, ego, insecurity, a difference of views, fear of man, rejection, distrust, unresolved trauma. Conflict could be positive. You're passionate about what you should be doing or what is right. Sense of justice, perhaps. Past hurts, different truths. All truths. Truths are relative, some would say. There's communication, perception, opinions, inability to see another person's viewpoints, personal triggers, activism, sin. So on this slide, you will see 3 words: the flesh, the world, and the enemy. I think all your feedback is super helpful, and we can probably create an affinity diagram to slot them into the 3. So the flesh, let's deal with that quickly. This would be the old man, the old nature, the old self. So in Galatians 5:16 to 17, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. Our sinful nature is always in opposition and in rebellion against God. Romans 17, just the first verse there, verse 15, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate to do, I do. So why does conflict exist? Well, because of our flesh, you and I, our old self that battles against the sanctified, redeemed self. The world, there is an organized and rebellious system at play. And you can read this in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 to 17. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh. So we could call this the physical desires, the lust of the eyes, the beautiful externals, and the pride of life, our selfish ambitions, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. That's 1 John. So not only does the flesh drive us in opposition to God's will and purpose, but we also live within a system called the world that is inherently rebellious. And then don't forget the enemy, James 4 and 1 Peter. The devil is real. Submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. 1 Peter. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Verse 8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him. Stand firm in the faith. Okay, so inherently, the flesh, the system we're in, the world, and then the enemy. These are the reasons I would propose to you why conflict occurs. In the 54 platform, you will see that we have introduced to you a range of team development frameworks. And so for today, I'll show you 2 of them. The first would be from Tuckman. It's called the Tuckman Team Development Model. And it shows you 5 steps for how every team progresses. And each step builds on the previous one. Each step is preparatory, and actually skipping can affect the performance of your team negatively, your organization negatively. So the first will be forming, followed by storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And so when we think about conflict, what is clear is the storming stage is where conflict is most visible. But it's very, very important that you allow for it and that you allow it. Because why is storming important? It reveals to you as the organizational leader, are there power and control issues? It shows you that personal agendas are surfacing. Sometimes there's a power struggle, and you can observe cliques or splinter groups. Storming is important. The conflict in the storming is important because it helps your group to develop skills in communication. It also creates a space where people are able to express their differences of ideas and feelings, of preferences, opinions, and convictions. And it's actually quite insightful for you as the leader to know that, to understand how people are receiving your leadership. And so the storming phase is not something to be afraid of or to shun. It also shows you that perhaps your team members are still very independent, or perhaps even counter-dependent. There could be anxiety. You will see a high degree of competition, especially if people are jockeying for roles and positions and titles. There can be little team spirit, and you might experience personal attacks or very low buy-in and low participation in the vision and mission of your team. Again, the point is, if you want to progress through the group or team development model, you have to go through every stage. If you don't, and then the next slide will be helpful for you to understand. If you don't, your team or your organization will remain what is called a pseudo team or a fake team, to make it easy. So when you look at this graph, on the left would be performance, level of performance, and then on the right would be the effectiveness of the team, or you could also change it to time, right? The progression of time. So what happens with a working group? Individuals come together for whatever reason. And typically there is excitement, there's energy. This would be the forming stage. So you could actually take this graph, this curve, and map it against the previous diagram that we showed you by Tuckman. And you can just, you can exchange the words. But a working team would be the forming stage, a group of disparate people, individuals who come together. High excitement. So there is performance, there is a lot of energy and excitement and vitality. But what happens as you enter the storming stage, if you don't allow the storming stage, what happens is the team becomes fake. They don't speak truth, or they do it, but not when they're together with each other. They do it in the coffee breaks, or they do it outside, or they do it on private messages, and undermining sometimes all that is good with the mission or the vision. So that's a pseudo team. And nobody likes a pseudo team. And I think the problem, and I'll show you a couple of some stats later, but a pseudo team is unable to perform at a high level because there is very little ownership or stewardship of the vision mission of the organization. But if you can break through and you facilitate, you leverage the conflict and the storming stage, you can then move into the potential team, thereafter the real team, followed by a high performance team. So this is called the Katzenbach curve, and you can read this in a book called The Wisdom of Teams. But I do want to say, because we are faith-based leaders, high performance team is not the terminal point of any team performance, okay? Because the Bible actually teaches us there is another level that is beyond this. And this is called the body. What's a working group? Think of it as salad. You know, you can pick apart a salad and still tell what's the cucumber, what's the lettuce, what's the beetroot, what's the cucumber. But when you get into a high performance team or a body, it's like stew where everything is boiled, or soup where everything is boiled together and you can't pick it apart. It's all one now. And I think that's a beautiful picture to bear in mind as the body of Christ. You know, there is something beyond, and we're called to go beyond. Okay, so we want to give you an opportunity now to work through what you've heard. So we're going to put you in a breakout room for 10 minutes. I'd like you to introduce yourself very quickly and also appoint a facilitator. All right, so what you can do in the appointing of a facilitator is find out of the 3 or 4 in your breakout room whose birthday is coming next. That person whose birthday is coming next will now be de facto the facilitator. All right, so what's your role as the facilitator? Your role as the facilitator is ensure that everybody gets an opportunity to share. You keep within the time. If there's a need to report back, you can help do that. You make sure that the conversation moves. And I would recommend that you allow in your group one of the following people to speak first. Either the female, the woman, speaks first, or the youngest speaks first, or somebody whose English is not their first language. Let them speak first. And then we will hopefully get lots of contribution by everyone. You'll see the guidelines on the screen. Share what you're comfortable to share, you know, and listen well. Turn on your cameras if you can. If you need help, there's a help button. Please, whatever is shared, you would keep it in confidence. And the question you need to respond to after you introduce yourself is, share about a conflict that you're dealing with right now, or currently, or recently, and just share with each other. Okay, so take about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes per person for this. Welcome back. Welcome back. So, was there any crying in your breakout room? Conflict is painful. I empathize with you guys.
There wasn't enough time to cry.
Oh, okay. There will be 2 more breakout rooms, so there is opportunity.
What must we do if we had conflict in our breakout rooms?
Don't leave this call. Stay on to the end, and then you will find a resolution. Under God, we are trusting in His goodness, grace and mercy. I want to invite you into a poll, and we'll use the AHA slides again. So just refresh your screen on the device that you're using and answer this question. What is your default approach for handling conflict when it arises? And there are 5 options, okay? So if you're familiar with these 5 words, that's great. If you're not, I'll just talk them through really quickly. Compete means there's only one right answer. I'm right, you're wrong. Collaborate is, okay, we find a third alternative. It's not you, it's not me. Let's find a third option and work together. Avoid would be, you know, we're not even going to address this issue at all, this conflict. Let's turn away. Compromise, it's find a middle ground. Accommodate is you're right and I'm wrong. And so whenever you are as the organizational leader in a situation of conflict, what is your default? What do you default to? Not what you think is best, right? Because most people would immediately say, yeah, I'm a Christian, collaborating is best. But what is your default? Don't worry, it's anonymous. You don't have to impress us. We have about 14, 15 responses and 29 people. So refresh your screen on AHA and choose one. So as you're filling this in, obviously this poll or this AHA slide is a self-perception survey, right? How do you perceive yourself? What will happen once we shut this poll is we will introduce you to a personal profile that you can take. We will send it to you after the Zoom webinar, and you will get it in your inbox. It's called the Thomas Kilmann assessment, and it will give you a series of statements that you can then self-identify whether this is typical or not typical of you. And this will actually give you a good indication as to which is your default approach. Okay, so you may have given the right answer, but the assessment would be worthwhile for you to do so that you get a slightly deeper assessment of where you are and what your default is. Okay, so why do we default to certain styles? And Nina, can we go back to the AHA and see where things are? Okay, so most would say I tend to collaborate. Some more honest people say I compete, I avoid, I compromise. And very few leaders say you're right, I'm wrong. That's also interesting in and of itself, right? But why do we default to certain styles? Part of it could be, you know, your cultural predisposition. And as an Asian person, I am Malaysian by nationality, but ethnically Chinese. And I grew up in a very strong shame-based culture. And so conflict is not something you enter into lightly, especially with people that have position or seniority. And so culture can affect your default. I think some people would use the word personality or behavioral style or your temperament. That also has an influence. I think whether you were a single child or you had many siblings, that also affects your default. I mean, it's hard to compete when you're the only child, isn't it? Exposure in leadership, the coaching or mentoring that you receive, perhaps your personal wrestle with, a biblical perspective for how to handle conflict. Oftentimes in church, you hear Matthew 18, Matthew 18, Matthew 18. And Matthew 18 is a very biblical way of dealing with conflict. Matthew 18 is also what most global North or Western leaders would immediately go to as a way of resolving conflict. Go right up to the person and confront that person. It's a default for, I think, many Westerners. And that I say this as a generalization and also a perception on my end. So let me take you through a model that is available for you to use, and more information is also on the 54 platform. But this is called the Thomas Kilmann conflict handling model, okay? Developed by two persons, one called Kenneth Thomas, the other Ralph Kilmann. That's why it's called the Thomas Kilmann. And it's a framework that provides insight into how individuals, leaders can approach and handle conflicts. And as an Asian, I can tell you, it was so helpful for me to have the vocabulary to think about conflict handling, because I don't think I really saw this model very well in my home growing up. And this model will outline 5 ways or 5 primary styles for handling conflict. And it's a combination of assertiveness and cooperativeness. So what is assertiveness? It's the extent to which you pursue your own interests to satisfy your concern. So the more you want your interests and your concerns satisfied, that is being highly assertive. What is cooperativeness? The extent to which you consider the interests of others. So if you don't consider their interests, then you're uncooperative. If you take into account their interests, then you're highly cooperative, right? Vice versa for assertiveness. So this is a great picture to have in mind. And what I'm going to do now is just to run through it with a little more detail. Nina, you can go to the next slide. And the only difference between this next slide with the one before is this slide on the far right. It shows you the conflict outcomes. Okay, so let me unpack this. And I think after I'm done with unpacking this, Nina can go back to the previous slide. And if you have questions, feel free to also put it in the chat box and we can come to it. Or it may be addressed over the course of this webinar. So what is competing? Competing is where you pursue your own interests at the expense of others. It's focused on winning. That's the key word, win. And if you're the leader, then it usually involves asserting your power or your authority or your seniority or your expertise. And this can lead to a potential win-lose outcome. Why is it win-lose? Well, you win, the other party loses. So it is effective. All right, it's very effective. But it is effective typically in the short run. It's not as effective in the long run, because if power shifts and the loser now takes your role or gets the upper hand, it could even create greater confrontations. And that's why highly autocratic or highly assertive leaders, when it's time for them to step down or step sideways in the organization, they may not have a very peaceful, harmonious transition. And learning to be number 2 is quite challenging, because now the power dynamic shifts. So it could be quite bitter. What's collaborating? It emphasizes finding mutually satisfactory solutions. And most of you chose this as your default, yeah? But let's see if you understood the definition the same as it's going to be outlined here. Involves open communication, involves active listening. There's a high willingness to explore different perspectives to reach consensus. And the word consensus is very important, okay? It's intensive and it takes a lot of time. So it's one of the slowest ways to resolve conflict, because collaboration is not my way, not your way, but our way, a third alternative. And that's why the outcome is win-win. It always requires sacrifice, because you cannot find a mutual win-win unless you sacrifice your position in order to identify the third alternative. Okay? This can lead to a potential win-win. So using this style, conflict is not bad. Rather, it's a symptom of a problem to be solved rather than a battle to be won. And this is key. You're not fighting each other. You're actually looking to find a way forward together. Okay? And that takes time, it takes creativity, it even takes goodwill, it may take some negotiation. But the desire here is integration of what is initially perceived as completely opposite binary views. Okay, so that's collaboration. And okay, next one, compromising. What is that? This is where you try to find the middle ground by giving and taking. So it's about concessions. Find a mutually acceptable solution that partially satisfies both parties. That's why it's called half win-win. You don't get everything that you want. Actually, compromise could even be seen as a form of lose-lose, where the middle ground position is adopted. It doesn't please both parties. It doesn't give anyone total victory nor total defeat. Okay, so it's a compromise. It's an intermediate on assertiveness and cooperativeness. So that's half win-win. It's okay for the short term, but it's not sustainable. What's avoiding? This is easy. Sidestepping, postponing, turning away from, ignoring, maybe used when the issue is trivial or when emotions are really high. And so when emotions are high, let's say, between my spouse and I, sometimes instead of leaning in, it's better to say, okay, let's press pause, let's calm down so that we don't say things we don't mean. Break away, and then at the mutually agreed upon time, we come back again in order to work things through, okay? So sometimes there are urgent, important things that need to be done, and so the trivial needs to be put aside, and so that's a form of avoiding the conflict. But it's because there are other more urgent priorities, more compelling needs, and therefore a lose-lose outcome because neither party is addressing the issue. And then the final conflict handling style would be accommodating. So this style entails sacrificing your own interests to satisfy the interests of the other party. It requires you to be selfless. Oftentimes the desire is to maintain harmony and to preserve relationships. And this is why it's called a lose-win. And I think this is what the church would trumpet a lot, right? The whole turn your other cheek. And the danger with accommodating, if used 100% of the time, is you never go through the storming stage. You never transcend or go beyond the pseudo theme. There's a false harmony that is artificial. And I think being fake, being superficial, having a mask on is an issue. It's not that people don't have opinions or thoughts or feelings. They do. It's just that it's not voiced or verbalized or shared. And there is no authenticity. And so over the long term, this is a problem. So this model I found to be really helpful for me. And like you, I am part of different teams. And it's given me language, it's given me a framework for how to understand different ways to resolve conflict. And all of us have a different preference. So when you do the questionnaire that we will send to you later, you will see that, you will not have all of your score on one style. You are a blend of all five. You probably use a blend of all five, okay? And the most effective will depend on the situation and the outcome. So if you learn these 5 styles, I think you can better navigate conflicts, choose the right strategies, and maybe even help to facilitate constructive resolution. Okay? Conflict is not bad. It's potentially good. So here is what we like to do now. Go to your AHA slide again, refresh the screen if you need to. I'm using my phone, hence the need to refresh. If you're on another device, you might need to do something else. So based on the conflict that you shared earlier in the first breakout room, or the one that you were planning to share but didn't get the time to share, which of these would be most helpful in conflict that you are presently handling? Okay, so think about this. What would you use? I'll share with you a personal anecdote right now. A couple of weeks ago, one of my team members has come out of a health crisis, and because of that health crisis, he's become more urgent in his processes. And in the past, we would work more in a consensus, but because of this sense of urgency, he's been pushing through without necessarily consulting it in advance. Or even when he consults in advance and feedback is given, he has not incorporated that. So he lives in a different country, and I actually flew and spent a lot of money to fly to his country to be with him. And so we were together for a day. And obviously deeply listening well was very important. Avoiding wasn't an option because it needed to be dealt with. His process would have led to, an exercise that could have jeopardized the safety of our leaders in this restricted world. And so it's not something that we could avoid. We couldn't accommodate it for that reason because of the security concern. And competing was not going to be helpful at all. And so we managed to find a collaborative solution forward. And so having these ways of dealing with conflict was helpful for me in a very practical way. This was a scant 2 weeks ago. Okay, so in the conflict that you're in right now, which is most helpful? So most of you have said collaborating, others compromise. Quick win needed. Let's find a half win-win. Hey, one bold person say, maybe it's my fault. Maybe I need to give in. Maybe I need to be selfless. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not wrong, or maybe I just need to sacrifice and allow the other person to progress. One other person say compete. Okay. So we have an exercise for you. And there's a question I usually like to ask in the conflict handling workshops that I run. And the question would be, what's the best way? What's the best style to use? And then you hear everyone respond, this is the best, that's the best. Inevitably, all leaders, Christian leaders especially, would say collaborating is the best. So in your breakout room now, we like you to do the following. Forget the first question, not which style is the best. Go to the second one. Which style did Jesus use? Welcome back, everyone. So, any conflict in your groups? I think some are really easy to identify, For example, compete. Compete is easy, isn't it? Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. Did many of you get that? And compromise, the one I think of always is Matthew 22, paying taxes to Caesar. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. No one likes paying taxes, but Jesus compromised. Accommodate. The one I like is Mary coming to him and saying, turn water into wine. Come on, this party's got to go on. And Jesus said, not my time, but okay, I'll do it for you. Jesus lost. Mother won, which is quite normal. And avoid is also interesting. I think the two that you immediately find would be in Luke 4 and in John 6. Luke 4, they want to throw him off the cliff, and he passed through the crowd. And in John 6, he withdrew to the mountain because they wanted to make him king. And he didn't want a part of that. He didn't want to debate. He didn't want to have conflict. He just withdrew. He passed through also. Collaborate, obviously the cross. But it's also fascinating to see, he wants to do the will of the Father. It's for the redemption of man. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's like, not my will, but yours. So a bit of accommodate there. But I think the picture of the cross is a great collaboration example. So what is the best conflict handling behavior or style? what can we learn from Jesus? Obviously, it's situational, isn't it? And it depends on the specific conflict. It depends on the skill with which the mode is used. And again, to reinforce that all of you, all of us, are capable of using all 5 conflict handling styles. None of us ought to use a single one. You know, none of us should be only using one. You know, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, isn't it? So let's not be rigid when we deal with conflict. And obviously, some of you will have a default which you feel more comfortable with, and you will rely on that a bit more. But the purpose of today's call and webinar is to just help you with a variety of other ways that could be useful. Here's a research that we want to share with you. This was done with a group of church leaders and by Robert Dale, and they surveyed 200 leaders on conflict management. And here is what is the theoretical preferred order for use within a church context. So like most of you in the AHA slide, you said, well, the most theoretical desirable, the one that I use most, or I think leaders should use the most, would be collaborate, followed by compromise, followed by accommodate, compete, and then avoid. Ian asked a question in the chat box. When is competing acceptable? And my response to that is competing should be used when it has to do with a matter of justice and when it has to do with a matter of protecting the last and the least, the vulnerable. Okay? And competing is less about getting your own way, I think. But in this case, I would apply it. If someone needs to be defended, man, you fight for them. So I think Jesus overturned the table in the temple because he was defending, you know, God's intended purpose for the temple. It wasn't so much that I think he was personally upset, right? And that's my interpretation. So here's the theoretical preferred order within the use of church context. But the next slide, you will see this is what church leaders use. So not the theoretical preferred, but here is what they actually use. And what is most used would be compromise, then avoid, then accommodate, then collaborate and compete. And whilst it is great that we turn the other cheek, clearly it's not the only verse in the Bible. So it's something worth thinking about. Okay, we'll share this slide deck with you. Now, what we want to do is to make this Zoom call really practical. So we're going to send you back into breakout rooms. This will be the last one. And in that breakout room, we want you to take a moment to share what is your next step. How will you make what you've learned here today actionable? What's your takeaway? What's a highlight that you can immediately put into practice, especially if you are personally in a conflict handling scenario right now? I hope that was really helpful for you. Let's do the following. We're going to invite, I'm going to invite you to respond in the chat box. What did you learn? What's your one takeaway or one highlight from the past 85 minutes that we've spent together? So just feel free to type it into the chat box, and then we will draw this time to a close. We are created in God's image. In the Imago Dei, what is intrinsic is the need for relationship. And so at the end of the day, remember this, you know, that when one is in conflict, outside of the intrapersonal conflict, you will probably be in conflict. You will be in conflict with another party, with another person, another relationship. So let the preservation of relationship be at the forefront of your heart, your mind. Reconciliation between us and God, but also God between ourselves internally and then with another. That's key. We're called to a ministry of reconciliation. And we're called to preserve and protect and value relationships. If we want to be forgiven, we need to forgive others. And, every kind of conflict typically leads to some kind of opportunity for receiving or giving forgiveness too. And, number 6, don't take each other to court. Settle your disputes before you ever go that way. So, relationships. Well, it's been great to be with you today. I'll hand the mic back to Nina. And I trust that this was beneficial, and may the Lord help you to really be fruitful in all that you do as a result of this one little tool that can add to your toolkit.
Amazing. Thank you so much, John. That was incredible. And I know that everyone learned a lot and journeyed together. And I can just pray that the Spirit be with you in applying this and having the wisdom to know when to use which approach. So thank you so much for being a learner with us, but you've gone before us a little bit in exploring this topic. So we're honored to learn from you and with you. Thanks, John. So everyone, we've come to the end of our session. It is amazing to spend time with you, and I'm so happy to see all of the chats, and it looks like you've had a great time in the breakout room. I hope you enjoyed the time learning together and that it helped you unlock this tool to see that conflict is actually a great opportunity for us to strengthen teams, to move from being pseudo teams to being real teams, and to high-performing teams, and then to become more like the body of Christ, and to see conflict actually as a great tool to get there, as opposed to a stumbling block. So we have more events coming up, and like you see, these are great opportunities to learn together from specialists and other peers. So I would encourage you to have a look at upcoming events on the platform. Our next event is only in January, so you have enough time to test and apply everything that you've learned today. And then we'll be talking about mastering the arts of leadership transitions in January with Neil, who's also on the call. So we're very excited for that one. And then if you enjoyed this, and if you feel like you still want to engage with this topic, especially if you want to share it with your team, the content that we spoke about today is also in the course Growing Healthy, High-Performing Teams. So you can go to the dimension People, Team, and Values, and specifically Growing Healthy Teams. And you'll be able to find this specific piece of content, and also other amazing tools to help you grow healthy and strong teams. And we'll also share this presentation with you so that you have the content and the scriptures, and we really want to encourage you to also share this with your team and enable everybody to be able to handle conflict in a healthy way. Right, thank you everyone. There'll be a poll coming up. We would love your feedback. Like I said, we want to do this better and better, and we'd just like to know whether you enjoyed the session. So have a blessed festive season coming up. I hope you can take some time to rest. I know it will be well deserved and very necessary. So thank you for spending time with us, and I hope to see you at the next session in January or on the platform. I'll keep a lookout for all of you.